effects of prayer appear primarily to be due to what we call the placebo effect. Although prayer can certainly make a person feel better, there really is no solid evidence that it works miracles.
The oldest cry of the human heart is, "God, help me." And there are hundreds of studies that indicate that faith has an actual medical value. The medical effect of faith is not a matter of faith, it's a matter of science.
Since the beginning of recorded history, people of all nations, religions, and belief systems have prayed. Is there any evidence that prayer can affect the outcome of great events? Is there some scientific way to prove that prayer can heal? Has science or history given us any reliable confirmation that prayer can affect our life and the lives of those around us?
In recent years, there have been a number of studies on prayer and healing. There's religious bias reflected in most of these studies, and when you get right down to it, the statistics aren't all that dramatic in favor of prayer having a healing effect.
Prayer is one of the most fundamental of all human experiences, and so of course is an appropriate topic for scientific investigation, as long as we keep in mind the limitations of scientific investigation. Using rigidly constructed, controlled clinical trials will tell you something about the effects of prayer, maybe, but it tells you nothing about, number one, how prayer has an effect, and number two, what the meaning and the purpose of prayer is in both the lives of the prayers and the prayees.
Recent news polls show that 80% or better of Americans routinely pray. I'd say the evidence then is clearly in favor of showing that prayer is not a waste of time.
For thousands of years, people the world over have accepted the idea of prayer based simply on faith. Can it be demonstrated that such faith is justified? There are some political leaders who seem to accept the notion that there is power in prayer, but can prayer actually overcome nature? Could the simple act of prayer keep an airliner from falling out of the sky? Are there scientific experiments that can help us better understand the power of prayer? Or will it be our own experience that finally settles the question? Is there some irrefutable way to find the answer to one of history's most puzzling questions? Is there really power in prayer?
One of the great enigmas of history has been the seemingly wondrous power of prayer. For thousands of years, people the world over have accepted the idea of prayer based simply on faith. But modern generations, they're more demanding. Conclusions are one thing, but how those conclusions are reached is quite another. After all, we have better tools, more sophisticated techniques, better methods for getting at the truth. We should be able to determine scientifically whether or not there really is power in prayer. But is that even a proper subject for investigation? Abraham Maslow, a 20th century scientist and psychologist whose studies and writings have created much of our modern thought, wrote, "If there is any primary rule of science, it is the acceptance of the obligation to acknowledge and describe all of reality, all that exists, everything. It must accept within its jurisdiction even that which it cannot understand, explain, that for which no theory exists, that which cannot be measured, predicted, controlled, or ordered. It includes all levels of knowledge and subjective experience." All levels of knowledge and subjective experience. Well, that should certainly include prayer. We do have a great deal of knowledge, or at least awareness of prayer, and it is, by any definition, a subjective experience. But should we be looking for scientific answers to the question of prayer?
Some things should be off limits to science. I know that scientists routinely tell us that we're just drifting along devoid of meaning, but issues related to the divine really do not need scientific answers. Besides, prayer does not need science to legitimize or justify it.
The experts are by no means agreed as to whether or not we should investigate the power of prayer, but the investigation has been opened and the possibilities for discovery are endless. History, ancient and modern, is filled with stories and examples of priests, rabbis, and everyday people praying for the salvation of armies, nations, and individuals. What is even more remarkable, the historic records suggest that in many cases, prayer worked. In fact, we don't have to go back very far in that record to find startling examples with almost biblical results. In 1991, United States military personnel were in the Persian Gulf preparing to go to war once again. Military chaplains continually encouraged the men to pray for the safe return of themselves and their comrades. And back home, millions of Americans were praying for their sons and daughters. According to U.S. Marine Major General Charles Krulak, the prayers of both the military and civilians were answered. General Krulak was responsible for supplying the frontal assault against the Iraqi army. The threat of chemical warfare created a critical need for an ample water supply for decontamination purposes. The general had discovered wells that could supply 100,000 gallons of water per day, but then he received orders to move his base of operations 74 miles to the northwest to an area called the Gravel Plains. Attempts to drill for water produced only dust. Experts from oil engineers to Bedouins were unable to help. The date for the ground attack was drawing near and still no water could be found. General Krulak had met with his staff officers for morning prayer since 1977. Now the critical need for water was the focus of their prayers. One Sunday morning, shortly before the launch of the ground attack, a colonel abruptly interrupted the prayer meeting. It was important, he said, that General Krulak come with him immediately. The colonel took General Krulak down the road that had recently been constructed by the Marine Corps. What the general saw jumped out like a mirage in the desert. A pipe stuck out of the ground not 50 yards from the new road, and at the base of the pipe was a green diesel generator, a red pump, and a 1,000-gallon fuel tank filled with a type of diesel fuel the general says was not in use by the Allied forces. When General Krulak pushed the ignition button, the generator started up instantly. The flow of water from the well was within 10 gallons of the 100,000 needed each day to protect the troops. The general and over 20,000 Marines had traveled that road, yet none of them saw the brightly painted pump until that Sunday morning. General Krulak, in an article published shortly after the end of the hostilities, is quoted as saying, "There was no way anyone could have driven down that road and not seen the well and equipment painted in multiple colors. That well was the result of the prayers of righteous men and women." There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of stories, all related to prayer, that come from our military history. But so far, they all appear to be anecdotal. Is there any real evidence that anyone, from the poorest peasant to the grandest monarch, can in fact change anyone's fate through the simple act of prayer?
In the study, we found that religious attendance works to influence life expectancy and mortality. Researchers from the University of Texas at Austin, the University of Colorado, and Florida State University followed about 22,000 people over a 9-year period and found that people who regularly attend church or religious services once a week on average live to 82 years. People who attend more than once a week live on average to 83 years. But people who never attend live on average to only 75 years. We think something important is going on here. We've showed that religious attendance works to influence health behavior and social support, and those factors have important influences on mortality rates and life expectancy.
All of these studies begin with a bias, and the bias tends to be a religious one, and how much the bias affects the outcome is very evident in some cases. In other cases, it's hard to tell if the observer was putting aside his biases or not.
Since religion generally, and prayer specifically, is such an intensely personal event, we wonder if it's possible to construct a strictly objective test of the power of prayer.
The problem is finding even one person on this planet that's not prayed for. It's an amazing assumption that we make, that we could find such a group, a non-prayed for group, when in fact all over this planet, in every spiritual tradition, there are groups of people whose only purpose every day is to pray for every sentient being on the planet.
There are individuals, however, for whom the term scientific is simply irrelevant. These are people who have experienced the result of heartfelt prayer firsthand. We've recreated one of these events for you. The person telling the story is the person who lived the experience.
I came home one Friday evening to find my wife in tears. She was holding our baby daughter, who was crying uncontrollably and burning up with fever. My wife had tried to call the doctor, but was told he was gone for the weekend, and since we lived in a rural area, it didn't appear we could get professional help before Monday morning. Terrified by the prospect of what a sustained high fever might do to one so young, I held the baby close to my breast and began rocking her gently in my arms. Her cheeks and forehead were a bright red and took on a purplish hue with each anguished cry. Without knowing why, I turned and walked down the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The door was open and I slipped in and sat on the edge of one of the older children's bed. It was quiet and cool, and from somewhere in the depths of my memory, I recalled a passage from the book of John. And whatsoever ye shall ask in my name, that will I do. I placed my hand on my daughter's burning brow and dropped my head in prayer. As I asked God to comfort and protect our baby, I felt her fever disappear. My daughter's forehead, so frighteningly hot, literally turned cool beneath my hand. I felt it as surely as I have felt water turn from hot to cold. And almost at the same instant, the baby stopped crying. She looked up at me in the semi-darkness, and her tiny hand reached out and touched my cheek. Then she closed her eyes and went to sleep. My wife, concerned by the sudden quiet, came in and wanted to know what was wrong. I handed her our daughter and told her nothing was wrong. With a calm assurance I had never felt at any other time in my life, I said simply, "She'll be fine."
There are thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of stories just like that. Each one unique in its own way. And each brings up the question that is most often asked when it comes to prayer. Is it prayer that heals? And once that question is asked, several more questions immediately cry out to be answered. Is prayer the instrument of healing? Or is it something in the person's mind or natural energy that brings about the healing? Is there any way to prove that prayer does, in fact, help in the healing process? Have there been scientific studies done by reputable physicians or hospitals? If so, what were the results? According to this book, healing and prayer have been the subject of scientific examination for over a century. For many physicians, the idea that prayer can produce results different than the medical expectation is sheer nonsense. But that attitude might be changing. Remarkably, in a recent survey of 269 doctors, 99% said they were convinced that religious belief can heal. And an amazing 75% of the doctors said they believe the prayers of others can help in a patient's recovery. For Dr. Brian McMurray, every day is a real-life version of the emergency room dramas seen on TV. Dr. McMurray was an attending and teaching physician at the emergency room of Vanderbilt Medical Center when this incident took place. Not the credentials you might expect for someone who has an intimate relationship with prayer.
And 11 years ago, I saw this horrible, fatal illness and infection overwhelm a healthy young 18-year-old girl and take her life. And this horrible infection called fulminant meningococcemia just overwhelmed her and killed her. And I was her physician, and nothing I could do would make a difference. And I saw, 11 years later, another young girl dying in front of me of the same illness. And we saw her in the emergency department, admitted her to the hospital, and I knew she was going to die. She had all the same markers and signs and symptoms. And I prayed, and we went to the Sunday Bible study group, and we all prayed. The whole group prayed for this young girl. And 4 days later, she awakened and over the course of about 24 hours was able to come off life support, and 3 days later was discharged from the hospital. And I'm telling you, there is no doubt that was a miracle. I know the medical science. I know she was dead. She had no chance. And she made it. And I look at that now as God saying to me, see what you've been missing?
Just how powerful is the evidence linking prayer and health? More than 30 studies have found a connection between spiritual commitment and longer life. And according to some sources, there have been hundreds of studies that have been done. But have there been any conclusive results?
Scientists have been trying to find evidence for prayer for well over a century now. What I've tried to do in my writings is to survey this evidence and give people a chance to look at it so they hopefully can make up their own minds about whether or not prayer works.
When people make up their minds about the evidence for prayer, they also need to keep in mind that there's a generally accepted principle in science that the more extraordinary the claim, the more extraordinary the required proof. And that degree of proof is simply lacking in any of the studies to date.
Early in the last half of this century, one of the first attempts was made to study prayer scientifically. The experiment was implemented in 1951 at the University of Redlands in Redlands, California. The test group was comprised of 45 volunteers aged 22 to 60. 1/3 were university students. The other 2/3 included housewives, teachers, businessmen, and other community members. They brought a number of problems to this experiment, including depression, feeling worn out, exaggerated fears, even some requesting medical treatment when nothing was organically wrong. The volunteers were split into 3 groups of 15 members each. One group received only psychological therapy. The second group were instructed to pray for themselves every night before retiring. And the third group met weekly for a 2-hour prayer session. The study lasted 9 months. As described by the researchers, Group 1 had no improvement. Group 2 had a 65% improvement, and Group 3 had a 72% improvement. The researchers were delighted. They were convinced they had witnessed total healing in several participants in Group 3. According to the chief experimenter of the Redlands study,
repeatedly, under scientific test conditions, divorced from intense or high emotional persuasion, I have seen the beneficent results of prayer. In 9 months, for the first time in history, the results of a controlled experiment in prayer was scientifically measured, compared, and evaluated.
that may have been true in 1951, but will it stand up to scrutiny today?
The Redlands study belongs to the first generation of prayer studies. Although I admire the researchers for their courage in tackling this very controversial area, I have to say that many of the more recent studies are far better than the Redlands study.
In recent years, there have been a number of studies on prayer and healing. I've looked at these studies, and it appears that there's been a lot of bias on the part of the researchers that favors religious healing. And when you get right down to it, the statistics aren't all that dramatic in favor of prayer having a healing effect on the individuals involved in the studies.
In ancient times, medicine and religion were so thoroughly intertwined that the medicine man was also the priest. The first hospitals were founded in monasteries. Physicians of this era were usually monks, but the advent of the scientific revolution changed all that. So firmly was the church in charge of all truth that Galileo was forced to recant the things that he actually saw through his telescope. Today, the reverse is true. Science appears to be the sole arbiter of truth. So much so that while many of us can describe a reasonably good scientific study, few know the elements of prayer.
In September 1984, doctors confirmed that my wife, Mary Jean, had lymphoma cancer in her abdomen. The disease had spread to the point that she could not have removed by surgery. One morning, the question confronted me that I did not want to consider at all. It was as if God was saying, "Are you willing for me to take Mary Jean from you?" And my response in my heart was, "Of course not." But the question would not leave. It was like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane as he prayed, "Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." I responded to God and said, "Father, I do submit to your will." A great peace came upon my heart that never did leave.
In June, when we went back to see the doctor, I had real peace in my heart. And when he held up this negative from the CAT scan and it showed just a little scar left, I knew that God had done a miracle for me.
That was 15 years ago. She's been clear ever since. The doctor himself said to us, "I've only seen about 1% of my cases who've experienced divine intervention, and I'm glad that you are part of that 1%. I believe there are 4 principles that stand out in our experience that make prayer effective. Number 1, we need to get the mind of the Spirit in the things that we ask God for. And to do this, we must surrender our wills to the Lord. Second, we must trust in the power and in the mercy of our Lord. Third, we need to give God time to do what He wants to do and to teach us the lessons that we need to learn. And fourth, we need to realize that He does not always heal. This is entirely in the realm of His mercy and His purposes.
Now that we have some idea of what the principles of prayer might be, let's look at one of the more well-known studies and see if those principles apply. In 1988, cardiologist Randolph Bird designed a study as a scientific evaluation of the role of God in healing. Over a 10-month period, a computer assigned 393 patients admitted to San Francisco General's coronary care unit to either a group being prayed for by in-home prayer volunteers or to a group that was not remembered in prayer. The study was designed according to rigid criteria. It was a randomized double-blind experiment. Neither the 192 patients in the prayed for group nor the 201 patients in the not remembered group knew which group they were in, nor did the attending physicians and nurses know. Bird recruited various religious groups to pray for members of the designated group, with as many as 5 to 7 people praying for each patient. The results were most revealing. The prayed for patients were 5 times less likely to require antibiotics and 3 times less likely to develop pulmonary edema. None of the prayed for group required intratracheal intubation, and fewer patients in this group died.
4 of the most famous studies in prayer are the Dr. Bird study, the Elizabeth Targ study, the Dr. William Harris study, and the Dr. Mitchell Krukoff study. These studies show this. If what was being evaluated in these studies was not prayer but a new medication, this would have been heralded as a modern medical breakthrough. And it's no exaggeration to say that people would have been lined up down the block to get their hands on this stuff.
If the studies being discussed were not about prayer but about a new drug or a new surgical procedure, that would be an entirely different story. When a supernatural claim is being made, the level of proof required is what we call extraordinary.
Is it indeed another story, or is it another side to the same story? Pythagoras, the ancient Greek mathematician and philosopher, said that the most divine art was that of healing. And if the healing art is most divine, it must occupy itself with the soul as well as with the body. Today, the literature abounds with articles, papers, and books extolling the virtue of the mind, body, and spirit connection. The importance of connecting these attributes of the human system now appears to be one of the most prominent aspects of divine art. Actual scientific studies are, of course, more likely to be undertaken in the controlled environment of the medical community, where conditions can be carefully monitored. But if prayer can be scientifically proven to be of value in these situations, what does that tell us about the other evidence? Science requires the result of a study to be replicable in order to be valid. Is there historic evidence that meets that criteria? Does the evidence of multiple witnesses have any value? Can it be said that under a given set of circumstances, prayer will always bring about a predictable result? Is there data to support the idea of a meaningful power in prayer? Someone once said, "There are no atheists in foxholes." Anyone who's been in or even near live combat knows that's true, and more importantly, knows why it is true. But that's on an individual level. What of those who are responsible for the lives of others, the generals and politicians who are far removed from the foxholes? How do they view the concept of prayer? The history of the United States seems to suggest that leaders were being prepared from the very beginning of our national existence that would exemplify the spiritual values of the colonists and fold them into a great nation. In Virginia, 14-year-old George Washington was busy surveying fields for his family and neighbors. Even at this early age, Washington seemed to sense the special purpose God had for his life. By the time he was 20, Washington had filled numerous pages of his diary with some of the most beautiful prayers ever written, and he had made a practice of reading the first entry in his diary every Sunday morning. George Washington's mother taught her son to trust God and turn to Him with every need. When Washington left home to begin a lifetime of service to God and country, she told him,
"Remember that God only is our sure trust. To Him I commend you. My son, neglect not the duty of secret prayer."
In 1755, Washington was serving as a British officer on General Braddock's staff during the French and Indian War. He was just 23 years old, but he already enjoyed the confidence of his superiors and was often picked to lead dangerous assignments. One such assignment found him searching the frontier for John Fraser, a Scottish fur trapper loyal to the British, who had promised to provide supplies and information to the advancing British Army. But as the scouting party drew near to Fraser's home, they realized that something was very wrong. Knowing that the man he sought had no doubt been killed or kidnapped by the French militia or their allies, Washington still felt drawn to this little cabin in the woods. Once inside, he could tell instantly what had happened. A wilderness family had been attacked without warning. John Fraser and his wife were probably dead. What about the children? But once outside, Washington heard something. Following the sound, he saw a child's leg jutting out from a pile of firewood. Fraser had apparently just enough warning to hide the boy in the woodpile.
It's all right. Come on, boy. Put your head. Oh, there. It's all right. You have another.
Then they discovered a second child, both of them nearly frozen from their night out of doors, but their shivering was more from terror than from the cold.
It's all right. It's all right. It's all right.
There was nothing they could do now but to take them along. But even as they hurried back toward their own lines, Washington knew an army about to go on the attack was no place for two young boys.
I want to send the boys back to Philadelphia, as you requested.
Yes, sir. They have a grandmother there who's going to...
I know. But I can't afford to let you take those boys without some soldiers to guard you, and I can't spare the men.
Sir, let me go myself. With an Indian scout, I can have those boys back home before you know it. I can rejoin the unit then.
All right. But for heaven's sakes, hurry.
Yes, sir.
Sir, we're going to be staying with you now.
Washington explained that he was going to take them to their grandmother's house, and once again they were filled with fear. The French or the Indians or both could be lying in ambush along the way. But Washington told them what his mother had told him. If they undertook their journey prayerfully, they would be just fine.
I promise. Listen.
Then he gave each one of them tokens of his promise, as reminders that God would keep them safe. In this land, there were few roads, and often the shortest distance was a straight line through the woods. It was also potentially the most dangerous. At that moment, there was a sound of something moving in the woods.
We thought you were dead. Are you all right?
Yeah, I'm fine. Just stunned.
Washington had taken 2 bullets in the chest. The Indian scout had seen him stagger under the force of the impact, and yet, incredibly, he was not even seriously hurt. That was not the last time George Washington would be miraculously spared long before there was a United States, nor was it the last time he would be in the sights of that Indian chief.
Andrew! Joshua!
During a failed French assault on the French Fort Duquesne by General Braddock's army, the 6'3" Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him. 4 bullets tore through his clothes and 3 through his hat. He remained unharmed as he moved boldly through the shower of lead to help dozens of wounded soldiers. Of the 1,500 British soldiers, 977 were killed or wounded. The Indian chief who took part in the battle remembered Washington 15 years later.
Our rifles were leveled for him. We could not miss. I had 17 fair fires at him. The Great Spirit protects that man and guides his destinies. He will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire.
Washington was not shy about telling the world of his confidence in and reliance upon prayer. He was, in fact, known far and wide as the praying general. Examples of his willingness to go to his knees in prayer are found throughout Revolutionary War history. In one instance, the British had gathered the largest expeditionary force of the 18th century, and it was poised for an attack on New York. Under the command of General William Howe, 32,000 of England's best were on Staten Island preparing to put an end to the upstart rebellion. Washington's forces numbered barely 8,000. General Howe was committed to the task of wiping them out. His tactics were simple. Used 20,000 of his men to push the Americans back to the East River, making escape impossible. The river was nearly a mile wide and far too deep to cross. Washington and his men prayed for an answer. Without some providential help, the fledgling revolution would be crushed before it ever got started. Suddenly, for some inexplicable reason, General Howe decided to delay his advance by 2 days, giving Washington time to devise a bold plan. He would evacuate his troops at night across the East River. Under a full moon, small boats carried troops, artillery, horses, and equipment out of the reach of Howe's army. But by daybreak, there were still many regiments to be evacuated. The full light of the day would surely reveal their retreat, making them an easy target for Howe's soldiers. Major Benjamin Talmadge, an officer in Washington's Army, left a record of what happened.
At this time, a very dense fog began to rise, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards.
The fog remained until the last boat departed. Then the fog lifted as quickly as it had come, leaving 20,000 shocked British redcoats on the shore. 8,000 men had escaped certain death without the loss of a single life. Time and again, Washington expressed complete confidence that his prayers and those of his men would carry them to victory. So much so that when he crossed the Delaware River in January 1777 and found the British already there and waiting for him, he was capable of performing one of the war's most incredible feats of bravery. He galloped out in front of the battle lines and on his great white horse situated himself squarely between the opposing armies. There he directed fire. Volley after volley left men on both sides dead or dying, but Washington, whose white horse made him a perfect target, remained untouched by the shower of bullets. The Americans rallied and won the battle. The Continental Congress called for a day of thanksgiving and prayer. Washington seemed to take it all in stride. Washington became the first President of the United States of America on April 30th, 1789. As he concluded the oath of office, he added the words, "So help me God," and leaned over and kissed the Bible. Every president since Washington has repeated this appeal to God, and with good reason. Barely 100 years into its existence, the United States would face its most demanding test.